They say nothing survives in the middle of Lake Erie, not without a boat, not without help, and certainly not a 5-year-old German shepherd with torn paws and no land in sight. But that morning, Silas Whitaker, a reclusive former Coast Guard diver, saw something moving in the water. At first he thought it was driftwood. Then it turned its head. That head belonged to a dog, exhausted, barely alive, swimming where no animal should ever be. And when Silas pulled him from the freezing waves, he didn't just rescue a life. He unearthed a secret. A dog with no collar, no chip, no bark. Only a rusted tag marked with a single letter, O. But in those amber eyes, there was something more than survival. There was memory, purpose, a silent voice that had seen too much and could no longer forget. This wasn't just a rescue. This was the beginning of a mission nobody saw coming, and for Silas it would mean choosing between hiding from the past or standing beside a ghost who refused to drown. The morning fog still clung to the shoreline of Fairhaven, a sleepy lake town nestled along the southern rim of Lake Erie in northern Ohio. Spring had arrived late this year, and the air still carried a stubborn, unseasonal chill that prickled the skin through even the thickest of coats. The lake, often restless and churning, was eerily calm, its gray surface stretched like glass broken only by the occasional gull's cry and the soft lap of waves against dock pilings. The sun had not yet broken through the low clouds, casting the water in a metallic dullness that made everything appear faded, as if the world were still trying to wake up. Silas Whitaker rowed in silence, his calloused hands moving rhythmically against the oars, his breath forming soft clouds that disappeared almost as soon as they escaped him. At 44, Silas carried the weather in his bones. Tall and lean, with the sinewy frame of a man who'd once trusted his life to the sea, he wore the tired look of someone who no longer sought company nor expected any. His shaggy salt-and-pepper hair peeked from beneath a wool beanie, and his beard, uneven and speckled with gray, masked much of the solemn expression he wore as naturally as his worn flannel. He had once been a rescue diver for the Coast Guard and expert in recovery and loss, but after a mission in the Pacific left his best friend dead and his own lungs filled with water and regret. Silas had vanished into the inland heartlands, trading salt air for fresh water and crowds for silence. These days, he lived alone in a weather-beaten cabin tucked among pine and birch trees, far enough from town that the lake was often his only companion. On this particular morning, he had gone out hoping for quiet, just to row to listen to the water to keep the ghosts at bay. But something in the distance caught his eye, a dark shape adrift on the still surface, bobbing gently with the tide. He squinted, adjusted his course, and angled toward it. At first, he thought it was driftwood. Logs often found their way out from the river tributaries after storms. But as he drew closer, a deep instinct stirred in his gut, one honed by years of life-or-death calls. It moved. Not with the listless sway of debris, but with effort. Weak, irregular, but unmistakably alive. Silas dropped the oars and grabbed the binoculars from beneath his bench seat. He focused. What he saw made his breath hitch. A dog, no collar, no vest. Just a drenched German shepherd, dark fur, plastered to its frame, its head barely above the waterline. The animal's legs churned weakly, but it was clear it had been swimming far too long. Its body sagged with fatigue, and its eyes, if they were open at all, were vacant. Silas didn't hesitate. He pulled off his flannel, kicked off his boots, and dove into the freezing water. The cold hit him like knives. Lake Erie in early spring was no bathtub, and even with his training it sapped strength fast. But he powered through, cutting the distance with long strokes, eyes locked on the sinking creature. Each wave felt heavier than the last. Each second a cruel race against a clock he could not see. When he finally reached the dog, its body gave out completely. It didn't struggle. It simply collapsed against him, its weight sudden and alarming. Silas cradled it with one arm, kicking with the other, gritting his teeth against the cold. The dog's fur, soaked and matted, clung to his chest as he fought his way back to the boat. It took everything he had, but he hoisted the animal over the side and clambered after it. The dog lay on the floor of the boat, legs splayed, chest rising in ragged huffs. Up close, Silas could see it was a male, probably around 5 years old, with a thick coat of dark silver and black now tangled and rimed with lake salt. Its paws were raw, the pads torn and bleeding. Its ribs showed slightly beneath the sodden fur. But it was alive. "You stubborn bastard," Silas muttered, grabbing a blanket from under the seat and wrapping it around the creature. "What the hell were you doing out here?" The dog didn't respond, not with a whimper, not with a bark. Only a faint flicker in its golden eyes acknowledged his voice. But something passed between them in that moment, something unspoken and undeniable. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it wasn't fear either. Silas knelt beside him, breathing hard, body shivering. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered. But then again, "Neither am I." The boat drifted in silence for a few minutes before Silas pulled the oars back into position and began the long row toward shore. He kept glancing down at the dog, half expecting it to slip away, but it didn't. It just lay there wrapped in the old blanket, trembling, but alive. He didn't know it yet, but that dog wasn't just lost. He was escaping something, and what had seemed like an act of simple rescue was about to become something far bigger than either of them could imagine. The wind had picked up by the time Silas docked his skiff. The clouds above Fairhaven hung low and gray, dragging the day toward dusk, even though it was only late afternoon. The cabin stood about 50 yards from the small private dock, hidden among tall red pines and a sloping bluff of granite. Silas lifted the bundle of damp fur and bones into his arms carefully. The dog, still weak, barely conscious, did not resist. Wrapped in the thick wool blanket, he felt heavier than he should have not, because of weight, but of the quiet burden he seemed to carry. Inside the cabin was modest and rough-hewn. A cast-iron stove stood in one corner, a simple bed with a woolen spread in the other, and books stacked unevenly across every flat surface. It smelled of pine coffee and dust. Silas gently laid the dog down near the hearth on a folded blanket, then crouched to start the fire. Within minutes, warmth began to creep into the room, licking at the shadows like hesitant fingers. He stood stripped off his soaked undershirt and grabbed a flannel from a peg on the wall. Then, after filling a bowl with fresh water and setting it beside the dog, he pulled a second blanket over the animal's shivering frame. He didn't expect a response, but as he knelt, the dog slowly turned his head, eyes flickering like dying embers. Not alert, not fearful, just watching. "You're still in there," Silas murmured. "Good." He moved to the small kitchenette and poured himself a mug of black coffee from a steel thermos. As he drank, he kept one eye on the dog. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel entirely empty. Hours passed. The storm outside thickened, bringing sleet that scratched against the windows like claws. The fire crackled and popped, casting amber light across the cabin. Silas sat cross-legged on the floor near the dog. He wasn't sure when he started speaking. "I used to dive," he said, voice low and thoughtful. "Rescue ops. Spent 10 years jumping out of helicopters into seas angrier than this lake could ever dream of being." The dog didn't move, but his eyes blinked, once slow, deliberate. Lost a man in the Mariana Trench. Not to drowning, to silence. 1 second he was there. Next second gone. "We never found him." He paused. "After that, I stopped trying to save things. Figured the water took what it wanted." Silas looked over at the dog again, at the raw pads on his paws, the dried salt crusting his fur. "Until you showed up." The dog's breathing had stabilized, though shallow. He wasn't asleep. He hadn't so much as blinked in minutes. Just watched. "You need a name," Silas said aloud, leaning back on his palms. "Can't call you Hay forever." He looked at the old astronomy map tacked to the wall above the bed. A relic from his childhood. His mother had taught him the stars long before he ever saw an ocean. Orion. The name came uninvited, as though it had been waiting for a moment just like this. "You're a fighter, lost in the sky." Orion. He tested the name again, looking at the dog. "That work for you?" The dog didn't respond, but his ears lifted slightly. For Silas, that was enough. That night, Orion didn't sleep, but he didn't flinch either. As the fire waned, Silas draped a second blanket over the animal's side and lay down on the floor a few feet away, one arm folded beneath his head. Before he closed his eyes, he glanced over one last time. Orion was staring directly at him. Not with fear, with something else. Recognition. The next morning arrived in silence. The storm had passed, leaving Fairhaven blanketed in a heavy mist that clung to the ground like breath held too long. Birds didn't sing. The lake lapped quietly against the rocks, but its usual rhythm had slowed, as if nature itself were pausing to listen. In the cabin, the fire had gone out hours before, yet the room still held a faint warmth. Silas sat on the edge of his bed, boots, half-laced eyes fixed on the figure curled near the fireplace. Orion was still there, alive, alert though unmoving. His ears twitched as Silas stood and crossed the room. "You need to be seen," Silas muttered, grabbing his coat. "There's only so much I can do." Orion didn't flinch when Silas approached. He simply raised his head, eyes glassy but watchful, and slowly got to his feet. He walked stiffly, favoring one leg. Silas noted the careful way the dog moved, measured, deliberate. Not broken, just conserving energy. Fairhaven was a small town nestled between the lake and a stretch of pine forest. It had one grocery store, one hardware shop, and a single veterinary clinic housed in a 2-story converted farmhouse with white siding and green shutters that had long since faded. The sign above the door read, "Grace Animal Care." The woman who emerged when the bell above the entrance jingled was Dr. Elowyn Grace, and she was not what Silas expected. Tall and thin, with hair the color of dried honey tied back in a braided bun, Elowyn moved with the quiet authority of someone who had long since accepted solitude as a part of her calling. She wore a loose gray sweater beneath a navy lab coat, and her eyes, pale blue, nearly silver, missed nothing. At 33, she had the kind of gentle gravity that made animals calm, and people speak softer around her. Elowyn gave Silas a brief nod, then looked down at Orion, who stood by Silas's side still and quiet. "I take it this isn't your dog," she said, her voice low and steady. "No," Silas replied. "Found him. Middle of the lake." She didn't react with disbelief, only motioned toward the exam room. "Let's see what the water left you." Orion stepped onto the metal table with some hesitation but didn't resist. Silas stayed nearby, hand resting loosely on the dog's shoulder. Elowyn worked quickly, her fingers tracing each limb, inspecting wounds, checking joints. She murmured observations more to herself than anyone else. Deep lacerations on the pads, raw but already drying. Dislocated toe, likely from impact. Salt traces, not from this lake, more like seawater. Silas raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Elowyn met his gaze. "You ever swam in salt water long enough to taste it in your lungs? I have." Her voice turned a shade quieter. "I did my externship in Savannah. Coastal rescue." For a moment, there was a thread of silent understanding between them, one forged in cold currents and unspoken losses. She continued her exam, parting Orion's thick fur behind the neck. "Here," she said sharply, "there's something." From beneath the matted hair she extracted a tiny piece of rusted metal, no larger than a penny. It was oval, like the base of a dog tag that had snapped from its chain. On its corroded surface was a single engraved letter O. Elowen turned it over with a gloved hand, frowning. No chip, no collar, just this. Orion's ears lifted slightly, but he didn't growl. He simply watched Elowen with the same unsettling intensity he had shown Silas. "This dog's been trained," she said after a pause. "He doesn't react to pain, holds eye contact, doesn't bark. Look at how he holds himself. Like he's waiting for a command that never comes." Silas stepped closer. "Military, maybe," Elowen said. "But that kind of training's not local. Could be federal or even private. But someone put time and discipline into him, and then somehow he ends up in a lake 200 miles inland, no identification, half drowned." She didn't ask for an explanation. Silas didn't have one. Elowen reached into a drawer and pulled out a clean dressing and some balm. As she treated Orion's paws, she said, almost as an afterthought, "He trusts you." Silas tilted his head. "How can you tell he's letting me touch him?" she replied. "But he's watching you." That afternoon, Silas sat in the small waiting area while Elowen finished bandaging Orion's injuries. Through the half-closed exam room door, he could hear her speaking softly to the dog, her tone steady and low, as if reading lines from a script meant to calm a child. He didn't catch the words, but he recognized the cadence. A rhythm meant to soothe. When Elowen finally emerged, she had a quiet look in her eyes. "He'll need time," she said, "and shelter, and someone he can decide to trust." Silas nodded. "He's got me." The lake was still again that evening, so still it made the pine trees along the far shore seem as though they had been painted onto the water's surface. Silas sat on the cabin steps, a mug of untouched coffee resting on his knee. Orion lay nearby, head between his paws, his golden eyes scanning the woods just as they had the night before. Something in the dog had shifted since their visit to Elowen's clinic. He was calmer now, but not relaxed. Watchful. Quiet in a way that wasn't just fatigue. As the sun dipped behind the tree line, Silas caught movement brief, but enough to tighten the air around him. Just beyond the clearing, half hidden behind a crooked birch, a man stood. He wasn't close enough to speak. He didn't call out. He simply watched. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat and a low-brimmed cap. His posture was too deliberate to be random. He wasn't lost. Orion saw him, too. The dog didn't growl, didn't move, but his body stiffened. He locked eyes with the man across the field, and for a heartbeat nothing else in the world moved. Then, as if satisfied, the man stepped back into the trees and disappeared. Silas didn't follow. He just sat there, the fading light bleeding into his coffee, knowing that whoever the man was, he had come for Orion. The next morning, Silas returned to Grace Animal Care. Elowen was outside feeding the clinic's 2 long-eared goats, dressed in a loose brown cardigan and thick denim work pants. Her expression tightened when she saw Silas approaching alone. "Something happened," she said flatly. Silas nodded. "A man. Last night." Standing just outside the tree line, watching Orion. Elowen led him inside without a word. They sat in her cramped office again, a faint hum from the old heater rising behind the quiet. "Does the name Ronan Blakely mean anything to you?" Silas asked. Elowen went still. Then slowly, she leaned forward. "He used to work with specialized canine training divisions, government-affiliated but not public. Quiet stuff. I heard his name mentioned once during my externship in Savannah. He was connected to a program called Deep Echo." Silas frowned. Deep Echo, a classified unit. They were developing dogs for underwater reconnaissance, not just rescue animals, tactical operators. Advanced obedience survival in open water sensory coordination. It got shut down after something went wrong during a live deployment. a few years back. Silas sat back in his chair, thoughts racing. Orion, the wounds, the seawater, the silence. "Why shut it down?" he asked. Eloan shook her head. "That part I never learned. Only that it ended fast, quietly, files sealed, dogs decommissioned, and if one of them didn't go under, Silas asked." She met his eyes. "Then someone out there wants him to stay gone." The town of Fairhaven felt smaller in springtime. Trees bloomed cautiously as if unsure whether the frost would return, and the air buzzed not with insects but with a gentle anticipation. Children rode bicycles down dirt roads. Wind chimes ticked against old porches. But for Lucy Grace the world remained quiet. At 9 years old, Lucy was the kind of child who could disappear in a room full of noise. Petite with soft brown curls and pale skin that always looked a little cold, she had the gaze of someone who watched more than she spoke. Her eyes, a deep green, held a kind of quiet knowledge beyond her years. She hadn't spoken in over a year, not since the accident that took her mother's life and left her under the care of her Aunt Eloan. Eloan, for all her strength, didn't always know what to do with Lucy. She loved her fiercely, but love didn't always fix what silence built. Lucy spent her days curled in the corner of Eloan's office with a sketch pad or sitting under the old maple tree in the backyard tracing the shape of clouds with her eyes. She didn't smile, didn't cry, and never reached out until she saw the dog. It was the afternoon after Silas's second visit. Orion had been resting in a shaded pen outside the clinic while Eloan changed his bandages. Lucy had wandered from the house to the back fence, clutching a worn notebook. She stopped when she saw him, this massive, wounded animal lying still, his breathing quiet, and even his fur brushed but patchy. Orion lifted his head. They locked eyes. Lucy didn't scream. She didn't back away. She didn't speak either. She simply sat down right there on the grass legs, crossed hands folded in her lap. Eloan watched from the porch, unsure what to make of it. Orion remained calm. For a dog with a military past, one trained to respond only to specific gestures and voices, the sight of a child should have rattled something. But it didn't. He watched her blinked once, then rested his head again. From that day, Lucy returned to the pen each afternoon. She brought carrots, peeled apples, and once a half a grilled cheese sandwich she hadn't touched at lunch. She never reached through the fence, just sat with her back against it, humming very softly, drawing whatever came to mind. Orion never barked, never approached, but he began shifting closer each day, inch by inch, until by the end of the week he was lying just on the other side of the fence from her, close enough that their shadows overlapped. It wasn't until the following Saturday that things changed. The clinic had been closed early. Eloan had gone into town to deliver medication to a farmer's injured sheepdog, leaving Lucy with the instruction not to wander past the yard. But the woods behind the clinic, blooming with wild crocuses, and the remnants of deer tracks always whispered louder than rules. No one noticed when Lucy stepped through the broken slat in the back fence and followed the narrow trail between the birches. She didn't go far at first, but curiosity and silence are dangerous partners. Soon the trees thickened. The sun shifted. The shadows grew longer, and Lucy was lost. Orion sensed it before Eloan did. He paced ears forward, tail low, a low sound in his throat, not a growl, but an alert. When Eloan returned and saw Lucy's sketchpad abandoned near the pen, her heart skipped. She searched the yard, then the edge of the woods. Panic rose quickly. "Lucy," she called. "Lucy, answer me," nothing. Then a flash of gray moved past her. Orion bandaged paw, and all darted into the forest without hesitation. It took less than 10 minutes. 10 heart-hammering minutes. Orion found her. Lucy was sitting beneath a fallen tree, knees drawn up to her chest, eyes wide with fear. She hadn't cried, but her hands trembled as she gripped a crumpled leaf. Orion didn't bark or leap. He approached slowly, then sat in front of her head, tilted. She reached out with a shaking hand and touched his ear. Just once. When Elowen found them, Lucy was still sitting there, but her face had changed. Her breath was calmer. Her fingers had stilled, and Orion had moved close enough for her small hand to rest against his back. That night, Elowen tucked Lucy into bed and sat beside her longer than usual. Lucy stared at the ceiling. Just before Elowen stood to leave, a voice, small rough from disuse, broke the air. "His name is Orion." Elowen froze. Lucy looked at her aunt, eyes shining but steady. "He told me." The wind had shifted. Silas felt it in the floorboards of the cabin, in the way Orion kept glancing toward the lake as if drawn to something deep beneath the surface. Outside, Fairhaven was beginning to bloom in earnest daffodils, nodding under the weight of last night's rain, hummingbirds darting like secrets through the trees. But inside Silas's cabin there was a different kind of stirring, one rooted in memory, unease, and questions no longer willing to stay buried. It was after Lucy had gone home that night, after Elowen carried her sleeping from the truck and thanked Silas for watching over her. Orion had laid by the porch as they drove off, his golden eyes following the taillights like they held part of him now. And maybe they did. Silas stepped into the cabin and turned on the old desk lamp. Dust rose around its base. He hadn't touched this side of the cabin in months. A metal trunk sat beneath the window, sealed with rusted latches, scratched from years of travel. He opened it, slowly revealing folders, water-warped maps, and a laptop wrapped in a faded military towel. The laptop was a relic, thick, dented at the corners with a cracked hinge on the left side, but it still hummed to life when he plugged it in, the screen blinking once before loading a simple login interface. Silas hadn't used his clearance codes in years. After he retired from active service with the Coast Guard's Maritime Recovery Unit, he'd sworn off everything digital. But now, the silence Orion carried, pressed at his ribs, demanded space, and demanded answers. He entered the first code. Nothing. The second, still nothing. The third, access granted. The screen shifted to an encrypted internal database. Restricted files, case studies, after-action reports. He typed slowly, K9 Deep Echo. Nothing. He tried another route, lost asset reports, East Coast K9 units 3 to 5 years ago. This time, something blinked at the bottom of the screen, Asset 01. Decommissioned. Status presumed deceased. Location Blackwater Cove. Incident Deep Echo. 3.11. Failure to extract. Silas's breath caught. He clicked the file. It opened slowly. The contents were barebone species. Canis lupus familiaris. Breed, German Shepherd. Sex, male. Designation, Orion. A photo loaded younger, fully uniformed, standing at attention beside an unseen handler. The tag below read simply, Asset 01. There were no details of what went wrong. No listed handlers. No official comments. Just a termination notice. Presumed drowned during blackout failure. Silas leaned back in the chair, staring at the name again, Orion. The room was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock. Then he heard it, a low, almost inaudible whine. He turned. Orion stood just inside the doorway. He had not made a sound entering, but his gaze was fixed directly on the laptop screen. For a moment his muscles tensed, as though every part of him was waiting for something he couldn't name. Silas slowly turned the screen toward him. "You know this," he whispered. "You were never supposed to come back. Were you?" Orion's eyes stayed locked on the screen. He didn't move, didn't blink. But Silas could see something change in him. Not fear, not memory, but the weight of something remembered too deeply to show. Then Orion stepped forward, sat beside Silas, and rested his head against the man's leg. Later that night, Silas printed the file onto paper just in case. He stored it in a sealed envelope and slid it beneath a floorboard by the hearth. Then he turned off the laptop and stared into the dark. Orion lay curled beside the door. Not sleeping. Not entirely, just waiting. The wind picked up late in the day. Not a storm, but something quieter, ominous in its stillness. The trees along the edge of Silas's property leaned gently eastward, as though whispering secrets to each other through the branches. Orion had been restless since morning. He paced the porch, his ears constantly shifting, his eyes darting toward the long road that snaked through the woods. Silas noticed. So did Lucy, who now spent most afternoons sitting beside the dog on a wool blanket, sketching in silence. Lucy had changed in the weeks since Orion came into their lives. She was still quiet, still measured, but no longer invisible. Her pale cheeks had begun to take color again. She walked with more certainty sometimes, even humming softly while picking wildflowers near the fence line. When she looked at Orion, it was not with awe, but with understanding. Eloan stopped by late in the afternoon with fresh bandages and supplies. She wore a forest green utility jacket and jeans dusted with sawdust from helping a neighbor rebuild their chicken coop. Her blonde braid, normally neat and tucked, was fraying at the edges. She looked tired. "I've been getting calls," she said as she cleaned Orion's front paw. Town council asking if I've registered any large breed shepherds. Said they received a strange inquiry from out of state. Silas tensed. From who they didn't say. Just that someone asked for records, height, weight, breed, even GPS tagging data. Sounded like someone from a security firm or government contract group. Silas nodded slowly, then glanced toward the woods. An hour later, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, they came. The first sign was a low-frequency hum inaudible to most, but Orion reacted instantly. His head snapped up. He stood posture sharp-tail, lowered in a deliberate angle. Not fear. Readiness. Then the black SUV appeared, turning up the gravel path without lights. It stopped just short of the clearing. Two men stepped out first, both dressed in dark, tactical gear, faces obscured behind mirrored sunglasses. They moved in practiced silence. Then came a third figure, taller, no helmet, no armor. Ronan Blakely. Time had weathered him, but not softened him. His dark hair was flecked with gray at the temples, and a scar traced the edge of his right cheekbone. He walked with the stiffness of an old injury, but his presence was still commanding. His jacket bore no insignia, only a faint outline where a patch had once been. His eyes, slate blue and unblinking, fixed immediately on Orion. Silas stood at the top step, Lucy behind him, one hand holding Orion's fur. Blakely spoke calm and emotionless. Asset 01. Respond. Orion stood still. The two soldiers flanked Blakely, one of them lifting a small handheld device, flat gray, with a blinking green light. It emitted a soft pulse. Orion's ears twitched. His body trembled. He took a single step forward. Silas stepped between them. "He's not your asset anymore." Blakely regarded him without expression. He was never yours to begin with. He was left for dead. That was the mission protocol. Lucy's voice, small but clear, broke the tension. "His name is Orion." Blakely looked at her for the first time. His gaze didn't soften. "That name is not authorized." Orion suddenly moved not toward Blakely but toward Lucy. He positioned himself between her and the strangers. His muscles tensed. He lowered his head in warning. Blakely raised the device again. Silas stepped forward. "You try that again, and I won't hold him back." For the first time, Blakely hesitated. His fingers hovered over the device, then slowly dropped to his side. "You're making a mistake," he said. "No," Silas replied. "You already did." Blakely glanced once more at Orion, then turned. "Let's go." The men followed. The SUV pulled away slowly, disappearing into the trees. No threats, no paperwork, just a shadow left behind. That night, Orion lay curled at Lucy's feet in front of the fire. She drew in her sketchbook a simple scene of trees and wind, and a dog made of quiet defiance. Silas sat by the window, one hand resting on the hidden envelope beneath the floorboard. He knew they'd be back, but the next time it wouldn't be for recovery. It would be for control. And Orion had already chosen. The first true day of summer arrived in Fairhaven, wrapped in golden light and salt-tinged breeze. The lake shimmered like glass beneath a flawless blue sky, its surface broken only by the occasional canoe and the soft lapping of waves against the wooden dock. Along the southern stretch of shore, once overgrown and forgotten, stood a new hand-painted sign, Orion's Run, a place to heal. It had been 2 months since Blakely and his men had driven away in silence, leaving only dust in their wake and an unspoken warning behind. But nothing else came. No letters, no agents, just stillness. Silas kept the floorboard sealed where the documents remained, and life slowly shifted around the scar. Orion had stayed. Not just physically, but wholly. He now slept on the braided rug by the hearth and watched the front path like a quiet guardian. He played more, not in the way a puppy might, but with purpose. He ran beside Lucy when she raced barefoot along the sand ears, bouncing tail steady. He sat beside Elowen on the cabin porch, his eyes half-lidded as she sipped black tea and hummed without realizing. And Silas. He had begun to build again, not just the cabin, which now bore a small screened-in addition at the back, but something more fragile connection. Elowen had moved in unofficially at first. A few nights a week, then more. She brought her books, her plants, her habit of humming late into the night when she couldn't sleep. She had a way of existing beside someone without crowding them, and Silas, who had once considered silence a wall, now found it a bridge. Lucy had a bedroom now. It was small but sunlit with pale yellow curtains and a handmade mobile of glass stars. Her drawings filled the walls of Orion the Lake, a woman with a braid like her aunt's, and a man standing in a boat with a dog beside him. She still didn't speak much, but when she did, it was purposeful. She had given Orion a new tag, one she made herself out of clay and painted navy blue. On it was etched a single word in gold, free. That morning, the town of Fairhaven gathered by the lake. Not for a festival or parade, but for something quieter. The mayor, a petite woman named Jean Holloway, stood beside a wooden platform. She wore a sun hat too large for her head and a denim dress cinched with a leather belt. She was in her late 50s, cheerful, but no nonsense, the kind of woman who kept town hall running even when the power went out. Jean cleared her throat. "We don't have many heroes in Fairhaven," she said. "We have fishermen, bakers, teachers, and one very determined librarian. But every so often, someone comes along who reminds us what courage looks like." She gestured behind her where Orion sat calmly at the edge of the dock. He wore no leash. Lucy stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on his back. "We watched this dog come out of nowhere. No one knew his story. We only saw the pieces, the bandages, the silence, the way he guarded that little girl, like she was made of light. What he gave her can't be measured in medals. But we can give him something else." The mayor stepped aside as a wooden gate swung open. Behind it stretched a stretch of lakeshore cleared, softened and lined with stones painted by local children. Each stone had a message. "Brave found hope lives here." "This place is for him," Jean said, "and for anyone who ever needed space to run to rest or to begin again." Lucy let go of Orion gently. He walked forward alone, slow but steady until his paws met the sand. Then he broke into a jog, nothing dramatic, just motion. Lucy followed, laughing, her voice ringing in a tone so clear Silas turned his head sharply just to hear it again. Later that afternoon, as the crowd dispersed, Silas stood beside Elowen beneath the shade of a white oak. "She's different now," Elowen murmured. "And so are you." Silas glanced at Orion now, curled beside Lucy in the sand, both of them covered in sun and salt and sky. "I didn't rescue him," he said. "He rescued all of us." Elowen slid her fingers through his. "You know what's funny? What we were all a little lost, but somehow we all ended up at the same shore. That night, back at the cabin, as fireflies blinked in and out of the darkness, and the porch light buzzed faintly, Silas opened the floorboard and removed the sealed envelope. He walked out into the woods, Orion trailing behind him. He stopped at the old fire pit near the water's edge. "I don't need this anymore," Silas said aloud. Then one by one he fed the pages to the flames. Orion sat beside him, ears tilted forward, watching the fire burn the past to ash. "You're not Asset 01, Silas said. "You're not a file. You're not a ghost." He reached down and scratched behind Orion's ear. "You're home. Sometimes the ones we think are lost are the ones sent to save us." Orion wasn't just a dog, abandoned by a broken system. He was a reminder that even in silence, God speaks. That even when we feel discarded, unseen, or forgotten, we are still being guided. It takes faith to believe that something broken can become whole again. But as this story shows, healing often walks into our lives not with thunder or lightning, but with quiet pause, steady eyes, and the courage to choose love over fear. In a world where people are running from their pasts, where children go unheard, and where some hearts grow cold from too many winters, this was a miracle. A divine moment stitched into ordinary life. And maybe it's a sign for you too. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. And if you believe as we do that no life is too lost for redemption, comment Amen below. May God bless everyone watching. May you find your own Orion, someone who reminds you that you're never too far gone to come home.